They thought they could erase me from my own life, package me up like damaged goods, and ship me off to some sterile facility where I'd quietly fade into the wallpaper. What they didn't count on was that I'd spent 43 years in commercial, real estate, and I knew exactly how to make people homeless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassie De Vera, and at 76 years old, I discovered that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. I had built an empire from nothing, negotiated million-dollar deals with men in $1,000 suits, and turned abandoned lots into thriving shopping centers across Minneapolis. But to my own son, Marcus, I had become nothing more than an inconvenience wrapped in wrinkled skin and a Social Security check. The morning it all began, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee the way I had for the past 15 years since Harold died. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains I'd hung myself, casting familiar shadows across the granite countertops that Marcus used to trace with his finger when he was small. The house smelled like cinnamon and old wood, the kind of scent that builds up over decades of living and loving in the same place. I heard the car doors slam in my driveway before I saw them. Marcus and his wife Jennifer walked up my front steps with the measured pace of people approaching an unpleasant task. I knew that walk. I'd seen it from potential buyers who were about to lowball an offer, thinking the seller was desperate enough to accept anything. "Morning, Mom," Marcus said as he let himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago. Back then, it had been for emergencies. Now it felt like evidence of my declining independence, at least in his mind. Jennifer followed behind him, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she surveyed my living room with the critical eye of someone appraising property. She'd been doing that a lot lately, and I'd been pretending not to notice. "Cassie, you look tired," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with the kind of concern that sounded rehearsed. "Are you sleeping okay? Marcus mentioned you've been forgetting things." I hadn't forgotten a single thing. Not the way Marcus had stopped returning my calls promptly. Not how Jennifer's eyes lingered on my antique furniture during their visits. Not the hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when I walked into the room. But I said nothing. In real estate, you learn when to speak and when to listen, and I was in listening mode. They settled onto my sofa like they owned it, which given their recent behavior, they probably thought they did. Marcus cleared his throat the way he used to before asking for money in college, and I braced myself for whatever script they'd rehearsed in the car. "Mom, we've been talking, and we're worried about you living alone in this big house," Marcus began. His voice carried that patronizing tone that adult children use when they've decided their parents can no longer think for themselves. "The stairs, the maintenance, all those rooms you don't even use anymore." I sipped my coffee and waited. In negotiations, the first person to speak after a proposal usually loses. Jennifer leaned forward, her manicured hands clasped together in what she probably thought looked like earnest concern. "We found this wonderful place, Cassie. Northwood Care Center. It's got everything you could need. Meals prepared for you, housekeeping, even activities and social groups. You wouldn't have to worry about anything." Wouldn't have to worry about anything. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. What they meant was I wouldn't have control over anything, but they'd wrapped it in the language of relief. "We drove by yesterday," Marcus added, pulling out his phone to show me pictures he'd obviously prepared in advance. "Look at these gardens, Mom. And they have a library. You love to read." I studied the photos on his screen. Manicured lawns, beige buildings, elderly people sitting in wheelchairs staring at nothing. It looked like a place where people went to wait for death, not live life. But I kept my expression neutral, the way I'd learned to do when clients showed me properties that were overpriced and under-maintained. "It sounds lovely," I said quietly, handing his phone back. "But I'm not ready to leave my home yet." The look that passed between Marcus and Jennifer lasted only a second, but I caught it. It was the look of people who had expected resistance and had already planned their response. Jennifer reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. "Actually, Cassie, we've been doing some research," Jennifer said, her voice taking on that patient teacher tone that made my teeth clench. "At your age, and with some of the things we've noticed, like when you forgot Tyler's birthday last month, or when you left the stove on that one time, we think it might be best to get ahead of things." I hadn't forgotten Tyler's birthday. I'd been in the hospital for a routine procedure that Marcus knew about, but apparently hadn't shared with his wife. And the stove incident had been Jennifer herself, distracted by her phone during one of their visits. But she'd been quick to let Marcus believe it was me. Marcus pulled out papers from the folder, spreading them across my coffee table like he was presenting evidence in a trial. "We've talked to a lawyer, Mom. There are some documents that would help protect you. Make sure your affairs are in order. Power of attorney, healthcare directives, that sort of thing." I glanced at the papers, without touching them. Even upside down, I could read enough to understand what they were trying to do. Legal guardianship, financial control, medical decision-making authority. They wanted to strip away every right I had to make my own choices, and they were presenting it as a gift. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of," Jennifer added, her hand resting on the papers like she was blessing them. "The facility has a waiting list, but we've already put your name down. If we can get these signed today, you could move in next month." Next month. They'd already decided everything. The timeline, the location, the terms of my surrender. The only thing missing was my signature, and they clearly expected that to be a formality. I stood up slowly, not because I needed to, but because it gave me time to think. Through the window, I could see my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, working in her garden, her hands deep in the soil of the flower bed we'd planned together last spring. She was 82 and lived alone, driving herself to the grocery store and hosting book club meetings in her living room every Thursday. Nobody was trying to warehouse her because she was inconvenient. "I appreciate your concern," I said finally, turning back to face them. "But I need time to think about this." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Mom, we're not asking you to decide your whole future right now. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These are just protective measures. The lawyer explained that it's much easier to put these things in place while you're still—" He paused, searching for the right words. "While I'm still what, Marcus? Competent? Capable of thinking for myself?" I kept my voice level, but I could feel the anger building in my chest like steam in a kettle. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. But we both knew it was exactly what he meant. Jennifer stood up, smoothing her skirt with practiced precision. "Cassie, honey, nobody's questioning your intelligence, but you have to admit, this house is getting to be too much for you. And some of the neighbors have mentioned they're concerned too." That was a lie. I knew every neighbor on this block, had helped half of them buy their homes through my real estate connections over the years. If they were concerned about anything, it was the way Marcus and Jennifer had been circling my property like vultures. "Which neighbors?" I asked. Jennifer's cheek flushed slightly. "Well, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but Mrs. Chen mentioned she hadn't seen you in your garden as much lately." Mrs. Chen was 93 and barely left her house. If she'd said anything about my gardening habits, it was probably to compliment the roses I'd been cultivating for the past 3 years. But Jennifer was crafting a narrative, building a case for my incompetence, one fabricated concern at a time. I walked to the mantel where I kept family photos, my fingers tracing the frame that held Marcus's college graduation picture. He'd been so proud that day, standing next to Harold and me in his cap and gown, talking about the business he wanted to start, the family he wanted to raise, the man he wanted to become. That young man had looked at me with respect, with gratitude, with love that didn't come with conditions. "Tell me something, Marcus," I said, not turning around. When did I stop being your mother and become your problem? The silence behind me stretched long enough that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less determined. Mom, you're not a problem. You're family. That's why. We want to make sure you're safe. I turned back to face them, and for a moment, I almost believed he meant it. Almost. But then I saw Jennifer checking her watch, saw the way Marcus's eyes kept drifting to the real estate listings on his phone screen, saw the folder full of legal documents that would sign away my autonomy, and I knew better. They weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to protect themselves from the inconvenience of having an aging mother who still had opinions, still had assets, still had the audacity to want to live in her own home on her own terms. I'll think about it, I said again, this time with the finality that used to end negotiations when stubborn clients refused to see reason. Marcus gathered up the papers, but I noticed he left one behind. A brochure for Northwood Care Center with their contact information printed in cheerful blue letters. Just promise me you'll look at this stuff, okay? And maybe we could drive by the facility next week, just so you can see it for yourself. After they left, I sat in my living room holding the brochure, studying the faces of the residents in the photos. They all looked content enough, sitting in circles for activities, eating meals at communal tables, living lives that had been organized and scheduled by people who knew what was best for them. But I'd spent 43 years in an industry where I learned to read between the lines, to see what people weren't saying, to understand the difference between what was marketed and what was real. And what I saw in those photos wasn't contentment. It was resignation. That night, I opened the safe in my bedroom closet, the one Harold had installed back when we were young and paranoid about keeping our important documents secure. Inside, alongside my will and insurance papers, was a list I'd compiled years ago when I first started thinking about retirement. It contained the names and contact information of every client I'd helped over the decades, every contractor I'd worked with, every lawyer I'd negotiated against, every banker who'd approved my deals. I'd built more than buildings in this city. I'd built relationships. I'd earned favors. I'd created a network of people who owed me their success, their homes, their dreams. Marcus and Jennifer thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who would roll over and sign whatever papers they put in front of her. They were about to learn that Cassie De Vera had never rolled over for anyone in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. I pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, the way I used to when I was putting together complex real estate deals. Names, numbers, strategies, timelines. If Marcus and Jennifer wanted to play hardball with my life, I was going to show them exactly how the game was played by someone who'd been winning for longer than they'd been alive. The war for my independence had begun, and they'd just made their first move. Now it was my turn. The first thing they did wrong was underestimate my memory. The second thing they did wrong was assume I'd lost my spine along with my husband. By the time I realized they were serious about shipping me off to Northwood Care Center, I'd already started building my defense, one phone call at a time. Morning after their surprise intervention, I woke up before dawn and made myself a pot of strong coffee. My kitchen had always been my thinking space, where I'd planned my biggest deals and solved my most complex problems. The granite countertops were covered with the same legal pad I'd pulled out the night before, now filled with 3 pages of names, phone numbers, and strategic notes written in the precise handwriting that had closed million-dollar contracts. I started with Robert Chen, my former business partner who now ran the largest property management company in the Twin Cities. We'd bought our first commercial building together in 1987, a rundown warehouse that we'd transformed into premium office space. He answered on the second ring, his voice still rough with sleep. Cassie De Vera, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I was wondering when you'd call. Word travels fast in our business. What word is that, Robert? That your son's been asking around about quick property assessments. He contacted 3 different firms last week, wanting to know about market values for homes in your neighborhood. Robert paused, and I could almost see him leaning back in his chair the way he used to during our morning strategy sessions. I figured you either didn't know about it, or you were planning something that would make our old warehouse deal look like amateur hour. My grip tightened on the coffee mug. Marcus had been more thorough than I'd given him credit for. While I was thinking he was simply trying to pressure me into signing papers, he'd been actively researching the value of my biggest asset. The house Harold and I had bought 43 years ago, the one we'd renovated room by room, the one that had appreciated along with the neighborhood I'd helped develop, was worth considerably more than the $500,000 we'd paid for it. "I need a favor, Robert," I said, "and I need it done quietly." "Name it." "I want you to run a complete financial background check on Marcus De Vera and Jennifer Walsh De Vera. Employment history, credit reports, debt obligations, the works. And I want to know if they've applied for any loans recently, especially anything that might require collateral." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Cassie, that's your son you're talking about." "That's exactly why I need to know." Within 2 hours, Robert had called me back with information that made my stomach clench. Marcus and Jennifer were drowning. Their mortgage was 3 months behind. Marcus's construction business had taken a massive hit during the last economic downturn, and they'd been living on credit cards for the better part of 2 years. Jennifer's boutique clothing store had closed 6 months ago, leaving them with commercial lease obligations they couldn't meet. But the most damning piece of information was a loan application they'd submitted the previous week. They'd applied for a $300,000 business loan to restart Marcus's construction company, using my house as proposed collateral. The application listed Marcus as having power of attorney over my affairs, a legal authority he didn't actually possess yet, but was clearly planning to obtain. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the numbers Robert had given. My son wasn't just trying to warehouse me for my own good. He was trying to steal my home to save his failing business, and he was willing to lock me away to do it. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected, but the clarity that came with it was razor sharp. This wasn't about my safety or my well-being. This was about money, pure and simple. And Marcus had convinced himself that he was entitled to mine because I was old and therefore disposable. I spent the rest of the morning on the phone, calling in favors I'd been saving for decades. Margaret Foster, the estate planning attorney who'd helped me structure Harold's will, agreed to meet with me that afternoon. David Kim, the private investigator I'd used for due diligence on commercial properties, promised to dig deeper into Marcus and Jennifer's financial situation. And Sarah Murphy, who ran the most successful elder law practice in Minneapolis, cleared her schedule to discuss protective legal strategies. By noon, I had assembled a team of professionals who knew me not as a confused old woman, but as Cassie De Vera, the woman who'd turned empty lots into shopping centers and abandoned buildings, into thriving businesses. They respected my mind, my judgment, and my money, and they were willing to help me protect all three. The meeting with Margaret took place in her downtown office, the same sleek conference room where Harold and I had signed our wills 15 years earlier. Margaret hadn't changed much, still sharp-eyed and direct, with gray hair she wore like a crown and a handshake that could close deals. "Tell me everything," she said, sliding a legal pad across the mahogany table. I laid out the timeline, from Marcus's increasingly controlling behavior to the surprise visit with legal documents to Robert's discovery of the loan application. Margaret took notes in shorthand, occasionally asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. "They're moving fast," she said when I finished. "The fact that they've already applied for a loan using your property tells me they're not planning to wait for your voluntary cooperation. They're going to try to have you declared incompetent." The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs, a danger to myself and others, the legal equivalent of being erased. "Can they do that?" I asked. Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. They can try. But it's not as easy as people think, especially when the supposed incompetent person has a legal team that knows exactly how to fight back. The burden of proof is on them to demonstrate that you can't handle your own affairs. And given your professional background and current mental acuity, that's going to be a very difficult case to make. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began sketching what she called our defensive strategy. First, we'd create an irrevocable trust that would place my major assets beyond the reach of any potential guardianship order. Second, we'd establish a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation to document my mental competency. Third, we'd prepare counter-documentation that would expose Marcus's financial motivations. But here's the thing, Cassie. Margaret said, leaning forward with the intensity I remembered from our business dealings. Defense is good, but offense is better. If they're planning to attack your competency, we need to attack their credibility. And from what you've told me about their financial situation, they've given us plenty of ammunition. That afternoon, I drove to Northwood Care Center. Not because I was considering moving there, but because I wanted to see exactly what Marcus and Jennifer thought my future should look like. The facility sat on a landscaped campus on the outskirts of Minneapolis, all modern buildings and manicured gardens designed to look less institutional than they actually were. I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the main entrance, my heels clicking on the polished marble floors. The lobby was decorated in soothing beiges and blues, with expensive furniture arranged in conversational groupings that nobody was using. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, and the air smelled like disinfectant masked with artificial flowers. A young woman in a navy blazer approached me with the kind of professional smile that comes from years of practice. "Welcome to Northwood." "I'm Lisa, the admissions coordinator. Are you here for a tour?" "Yes," I said. "My family has been encouraging me to look at your facilities." Lisa's smile brightened, and she launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed presentation about Northwood's amenities, services, and philosophy of care. As she led me through the dining room, activity areas, and residential wings, I listened with the same analytical attention I'd once applied to commercial property inspections. The place was clean, well-staffed, and probably as good as institutional living could be. The residents I saw seemed content enough, participating in card games and craft activities, eating meals at assigned tables, following schedules created by people who meant well but had never asked what they actually wanted to do with their days. But what struck me most was the absence of privacy, of autonomy, of the small choices that make life feel like your own. Residents needed permission to leave the grounds, approval for visitors after certain hours, and compliance with meal times, activity schedules, and medication routines that turned every day into a managed experience. "This is one of our premium suites," Lisa said, opening the door to a small apartment with a living area, kitchenette, and bedroom. "It's quite spacious, and residents can bring some of their own furniture to make it feel more like home." I looked around the space, which was maybe a quarter the size of my current bedroom, and imagined trying to fit a lifetime of possessions into these beige walls. The kitchenette had a microwave and mini refrigerator but no full stove, because apparently residents couldn't be trusted with actual cooking. The bathroom had grab bars and an emergency call button, constant reminders that the people who lived here were seen as accidents waiting to happen. "What's the monthly cost?" I asked. "For this level of care, we're looking at $4,200 per month," Lisa said, as if that were a bargain. "That includes meals, housekeeping, and access to all our activities and services. Over $50,000 a year to live in a space smaller than my current closet, eating food I didn't choose, following schedules I didn't set, surrounded by people who saw me as a client rather than a person. And Marcus and Jennifer wanted to lock me into this place so they could take my real home and use it as collateral for their failing business." "It's lovely," I told Lisa. "I'll need to discuss it with my family." That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the awards and photos from 4 decades in real estate. Pictures of groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings, certificates from the Minneapolis Board of Realtors, letters of thanks from clients whose dreams I'd helped make reality. On my desk was the contract I'd signed for my first commercial deal, a small office building that had launched my career and taught me that success came to those who were willing to fight for it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Angela Rodriguez answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before starting her own practice. "Cassie De Vera," she said warmly. "It's been too long." "I need your help, Angela, and I need someone who knows how to go for the throat." I told her everything, from Marcus's financial desperation to the fraudulent loan application to my visit to Northwood. Angela listened without interruption, and when I finished, her laugh was low and dangerous. "Oh, honey," she said, "your son picked the wrong woman to mess with. Let me make some calls. We're going to turn this whole thing inside out." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the thrill of being underestimated by people who were about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake could be. Marcus and Jennifer thought they were dealing with a confused old woman who would quietly disappear into their convenient solution. They were about to discover that Cassie De Vera had built her career on making problems disappear, and she'd never met a problem she couldn't solve. The only question was whether they'd still have a roof over their heads when she was finished with them. The chess match began in earnest on a Tuesday morning when Marcus showed up unannounced with a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Dr. Gerald Hoffman, a geriatric psychiatrist. They didn't knock. They didn't call ahead. They simply walked into my kitchen while I was reading the newspaper and drinking my second cup of coffee, acting like they owned the place. "Mom, this is Dr. Hoffman," Marcus said, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness people use when they're trying to mask something unpleasant. "He's here to do a wellness check, just to make sure everything's okay." Dr. Hoffman was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of polished confidence that comes from having people defer to your authority without question. He carried a leather briefcase and wore wire-rimmed glasses that he adjusted frequently, a nervous habit that told me he wasn't as comfortable with this ambush as he was pretending to be. "Mrs. De Vera," he said, extending a manicured hand, "your son has expressed some concerns about your cognitive function. I'm here to conduct a brief assessment, nothing invasive, just a conversation to put everyone's mind at ease." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the way his eyes scanned my kitchen, taking inventory of everything from the pill organizer on the counter to the stack of mail on the breakfast table. He was building a case before he'd even asked his first question. "I wasn't aware I needed an assessment," I said calmly, settling back into my chair. "But I suppose if Marcus is worried, we should address his concerns." Dr. Hoffman pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the table between us. "Do you mind if I record our conversation? It helps with accuracy." "Not at all," I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out my own recording device, a small digital recorder I'd started carrying after Margaret Foster suggested documenting all interactions related to Marcus's custody attempts. "I hope you don't mind if I do the same." The doctor's eyebrows raised slightly and Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. They hadn't expected me to be prepared, and the presence of my own recording device had obviously thrown off their script. "Of course," Dr. Hoffman said, his smile tightening just enough to let me know I'd scored the first point. "Now, Mrs. D. Vera, can you tell me what day it is?" "Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, I replied. "Partly cloudy, high expected to reach 62 degrees. The Twins lost to Houston last night, 4-2, which means they're out of playoff contention. Again." Dr. Hoffman made a note on his pad. "And can you tell me who the current president is?" I answered his questions with the patience of someone who'd sat through thousands of property inspections, providing exactly the information requested without volunteering anything extra. He asked about my medications, my daily routine, my social, Activities, my financial management. Each question was designed to probe for signs of confusion, memory loss, or impaired judgment. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the previous week preparing for exactly this encounter. Margaret Foster had coached me on the standard cognitive assessments used in competency evaluations. Angela Rodriguez had provided me with a list of questions that were legally permissible and those that crossed ethical boundaries. And David Kim had done a thorough background check on Dr. Hoffman himself. "Mrs. De Vera," Dr. Hoffman said, flipping to a new page in his notebook, "your son mentioned that you've been having some difficulties managing your finances. Can you walk me through how you handle your banking and bill paying?" "Certainly," I said, reaching for the folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. "I maintain checking and savings accounts at First National Bank, where I've been a customer for 38 years. I pay my bills online through their secure portal, and I review my statements monthly for accuracy. I also maintain investment accounts with Merrill Lynch, managed by Tom Patterson, who's been my financial advisor for 12 years. Would you like to see my most recent statements?" I spread the documents across the table, each one showing healthy balances and meticulous record-keeping. Dr. Hoffman examined them briefly, his expression growing more uncertain with each page. "These appear to be in order," he admitted. "But Marcus mentioned some concerns about your judgment regarding major financial decisions." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on that patient tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "Mom, you've been talking about changing your will, making donations to charities, things that don't really make sense given your situation." "My situation being what, exactly?" "Well, you're living alone in this big house, and with health care, costs, and the possibility of needing long-term care, it just seems like you should be more conservative with your money." I turned to Dr. Hoffman. "Doctor, is there a medical reason why a 76-year-old woman with full cognitive function shouldn't be allowed to make charitable donations if she chooses?" Dr. Hoffman shifted in his chair. "Well, no, not necessarily. But if there are signs of impaired judgment." "What signs?" I asked. "I've shown you my financial statements, which demonstrate careful management and healthy balances. I've answered all your cognitive questions accurately. I'm living independently, maintaining my home, and engaging with my community. What exactly suggests impaired judgment?" The room fell silent except for the humming of my refrigerator and the distant sound of Mrs. Peterson's dog barking next door. Dr. Hoffman looked at his notes, then at Marcus, then back at me. He was beginning to realize that this wasn't the slam-dunk evaluation he'd been led to expect. "Mrs. De Vera," he said carefully, "perhaps you could tell me about your social support system. Do you have friends you see regularly? Activities you participate in?" I smiled, because this was the question I'd been waiting for. "I'm active with the Minneapolis Commercial Real Estate Women's Network, which meets monthly. I volunteer at the Hennepin County Library's Financial Literacy Program every Thursday. I'm a board member of the Riverside Community Center, and I attend book club at Grace Lutheran Church every other Sunday. I also play bridge with a group of women I've known for over 20 years. Dr. Hoffman scribbled frantically, trying to reconcile this picture of an engaged, active senior with whatever Marcus had told him about my declining mental state. "And what about family relationships?" he asked. "Well," I said, glancing at Marcus, "that's an interesting question. Until recently, I thought I had a loving relationship with my son. But lately, I've discovered that he's been researching the value of my home, applying for loans using my property as collateral without my knowledge, and trying to convince medical professionals that I'm incompetent. So I'd say our family relationships are somewhat strained at the moment." Marcus's face flushed red. "Mom, that's not fair. We're trying to help you. By lying to medical professionals about my mental state? By attempting to commit loan fraud? Using my property? By trying to have me declared incompetent so you can take control of my assets?" I kept my voice level, but I made sure every word was clearly audible on both recording devices. Dr. Hoffman looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Perhaps we should take a step back here. Doctor, I said, reaching into my folder again, I'd like you to see something. I handed him a document that Angela Rodriguez had prepared, a formal complaint alleging that Marcus had attempted to obtain a loan using falsified power of attorney documents. Attached were copies of the loan application, proof that Marcus had misrepresented his legal authority over my affairs, and a timeline of his attempts to coerce me into signing guardianship papers. Dr. Hoffman read the document with growing alarm, his professional composure cracking as he realized he'd been drawn into what was essentially a family financial dispute rather than a legitimate medical concern. Mr. De Vera, he said, turning to Marcus, were you aware that using someone else's property as loan collateral without their consent is considered fraud? Marcus stammered, looking between the doctor and me like a child caught in a lie. It's not fraud when it's family. I was going to pay her back. With what money? I asked quietly. Your construction business has been failing for 2 years. Jennifer's store closed with outstanding debts. You're 3 months behind on your mortgage. Where exactly would the money to pay me back come from? The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hoffman carefully placed the complaint document back on the table and began packing up his briefcase. Mrs. De Vera, he said formally, based on my assessment today, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. You demonstrate clear thinking, appropriate judgment, and comprehensive understanding of your financial and legal situation. I'll be noting in my report that you appear fully capable of managing your own affairs. After they left, I sat in my kitchen finishing my now cold coffee and reviewing the recording I'd made of our conversation. Every question Dr. Hoffman had asked, every answer I'd given, and most importantly, Marcus's admission that he'd applied for a loan using my property without permission. Angela Rodriguez was going to love this. That afternoon, I drove to the offices of Chen Property Management, where Robert was waiting with a stack of documents that would make Marcus's day even worse. I've been busy, Robert said, spreading papers across his conference table. Your son has been busier than we thought. The documents told a story of desperation and poor judgment that went far beyond what I'd already discovered. Marcus hadn't just applied for one loan using my property. He'd applied for 3, with different lenders, each time claiming to have power of attorney over my affairs. He'd also been in contact with real estate agents, asking about quick sale strategies for homes in my neighborhood. But here's the interesting part, Robert continued, pulling out a thick folder. Jennifer has been even busier. She's been meeting with divorce attorneys. I stared at the private investigator's report that detailed Jennifer's activities over the past month. Meetings with 3 different family law firms, consultations about asset division, and inquiries about protective orders for domestic financial abuse. Jennifer wasn't just planning to take my house. She was planning to take half of whatever Marcus got from my estate and then disappear. She's playing him, Robert said, and he's too desperate to see it. That evening, I called a family meeting. Not the kind Marcus had been orchestrating, with surprise guests and ambush evaluations, but a proper meeting in my living room, with advance notice and a clear agenda. I invited Marcus and Jennifer for Sunday dinner, just like we used to do, before money and desperation had poisoned our relationship. They arrived precisely on time, dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Jennifer carried her oversized purse, the one that always seemed to contain legal documents and recording devices. Marcus wore his best suit, the one he usually reserved for court appearances and loan applications. I served pot roast and mashed, potatoes, Harold's favorite meal, and made small talk about the weather and neighborhood news while we ate. It wasn't until I served coffee and dessert that I placed a manila folder on the dining room table. I've been doing some research of my own, I said, opening the folder to reveal copies of all 3 loan applications Marcus had submitted. I'm curious about these documents that claim I've given you power of attorney over my property. Marcus's fork clattered against his dessert plate. Jennifer's hand moved instinctively toward her purse, then stopped when she realized how guilty the gesture looked. Mom, I can explain. Please do, I said, settling back in my chair with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I'm particularly interested in these signatures that are supposed to be mine, but don't match any signature I've ever made. I pulled out a signature comparison chart that David Kim had prepared, showing Marcus's forged versions of my signature, next to my actual signature from various legal documents over the years. The differences were obvious to anyone who bothered to look. Jennifer finally found her voice. Cassie, honey, Marcus was just trying to explore options for your financial security. By committing felony fraud? I asked mildly. Because that's what this is, Jennifer. Falsifying power of attorney documents is a third-degree felony in Minnesota, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The color drained from Marcus's face. Mom, you wouldn't. Wouldn't what, Marcus? Wouldn't protect myself from theft. Wouldn't defend my property from fraudulent claims. Wouldn't hold my own son accountable for trying to steal my home. I reached into the folder again and pulled out another document, this one with Jennifer's name at the top. But fraud isn't the only crime we need to discuss tonight. Jennifer's hands clenched in her lap as she read the heading on the private investigator's report detailing her meetings with divorce attorneys. It seems that while Marcus was busy trying to steal my house, you were busy planning to steal half of whatever he managed to get from me, I said. Tell me, Jennifer, which one of you came up with the plan to warehouse me in that nursing home? Was it a joint effort, or were you each running your own separate con? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Marcus stared at Jennifer with growing understanding and horror. Jennifer stared at the floor, her careful composure finally cracking. I think it's time for you both to leave, I said quietly. And I think it's time for you to decide whether you want to try to salvage what's left of our family relationship, or whether you want to continue down this path and find out exactly how ruthless I can be when someone tries to steal from me. As they gathered their things and headed for the door, Marcus turned back one last time. Mom, what do you want from us? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and supported through every failure and disappointment of his adult life, and I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. I want you to remember that I'm not your victim, Marcus. I'm your mother. And if you ever try to steal from me again, you're going to discover that everything you think you know about me is just the tip of the iceberg. After they left, I sat in my dining room surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal and began planning the final phase of my response. They'd tried to make me disappear. Now it was time to show them what disappearing really looked like. The first domino fell on a Wednesday morning when Angela Rodriguez called to tell me that Marcus's construction company had been served with a cease and desist order from the state licensing board. Apparently, when you're under investigation for loan fraud, your professional licenses come under scrutiny as well. The Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry doesn't take kindly to contractors who falsify financial documents, and Marcus's attempts to use my property as collateral had triggered an automatic review of his business practices. It gets better, Angela said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just landed a knockout punch. The bank that approved his loan application, they're now facing their own investigation for failing to properly verify the power of attorney documents. When I showed them the signature analysis proving the documents were forged, they immediately called the loan and reported it to the FBI as potential bank fraud. I sat in my home office, looking out at the maple tree Harold had planted the year Marcus was born. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and I found myself thinking about cycles, about how things that grow strong can also wither when they're not properly tended. What does that mean for Marcus? I asked. It means he's about to discover that stealing from your mother has consequences beyond family dinner conversations, Angela replied. Federal bank fraud carries a maximum sentence of 30 years and a $1 million fine. Even if he pleads guilty and cooperates, he's looking at significant prison time. The second domino fell that afternoon when my phone rang with a call from Jennifer's divorce attorney. The lawyer introduced herself as Susan Walsh, and her voice carried the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked desperation. "Mrs. De Vera, I represent Jennifer De Vera in her pending divorce proceedings. I understand there may be some family assets in dispute, and I was hoping we could discuss a reasonable settlement that would avoid protracted litigation." I almost laughed. Jennifer's lawyer was calling me directly, which meant she'd figured out that the money Jennifer thought she was going to split with Marcus didn't actually exist. The house Jennifer had been counting on as marital property belonged to me, not Marcus, and the loans they'd applied for had been denied once the fraud was discovered. "Ms. Walsh," I said, "I'm not sure what assets you're referring to. My son and daughter-in-law don't own any property that I'm aware of. Their home is in foreclosure. Their business has been shut down by the state, and they're both facing federal fraud charges. What exactly did you think they were going to divide?" The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. Jennifer had sold her attorney a fairy tale about Marcus inheriting valuable property, and now the lawyer was realizing she'd been played by a client who didn't have the money to pay her fees, let alone fight a costly divorce battle. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Ms. Walsh said carefully. "I was led to believe that Mr. De Vera had significant real estate holdings." "The only significant real estate holdings in this family belong to me," I said. "And they're protected by an irrevocable trust that my daughter-in-law has no claim to whatsoever. I suggest you advise your client to focus on finding employment because her meal ticket just got canceled." That evening, I was preparing dinner when I heard the familiar sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. But this time, it wasn't. Marcus and Jennifer coming to pressure me into signing papers. This time, it was Marcus alone, and he looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 days. I watched him through my kitchen window as he sat in his car for several minutes, his head resting against the steering wheel. When he finally got out and walked to my front door, his shoulders were slumped with the weight of someone who'd finally realized the magnitude of his mistakes. He knocked this time, softly, like a stranger asking for help rather than a son demanding compliance. When I opened the door, I was shocked by his appearance. His face was haggard, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything and was still counting the cost. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk?" I led him to the living room, the same room where we'd had our last family dinner, where I'd laid out the evidence of his betrayal like prosecutor presenting a case. But now the manila folders were gone, replaced by the family photos and comfortable furniture that had witnessed 4 decades of our shared history. Marcus sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the coffee table for a long moment before finally looking up at me. "They arrested me this morning," he said. "FBI agents came to the house with a warrant. The neighbors all watched as they handcuffed me and put me in the back of their car. I felt a stab of something that might have been sympathy, but I pushed it down. This was a consequence he'd earned through his own choices, his own greed, his own willingness to steal from the woman who'd given him life." "What did they charge you with?" I asked. "Wire fraud, bank fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse," he recited like a man reading his own obituary. "My lawyer says I'm looking at 20 years minimum, even with a plea bargain." 20 years. Marcus was 48 years old, which meant he'd be nearly 70 when he got out of prison, older than I was now. I thought about all the milestones he'd miss, all the years with his children that would be lost, all the possibilities that had been destroyed by his decision to steal from me. "Jennifer left," he continued, his voice breaking. "Packed up everything, while I was in jail, and took the kids to her mother's house in Arizona. Her lawyer filed an emergency motion for full custody, claiming I'm a danger to their welfare. She's citing the fraud charges and saying I'm mentally unstable. I wanted to feel vindicated, to experience the satisfaction of watching my son reap what he'd sown. But sitting there looking at this broken man who'd once been my little boy, all I felt was a profound sadness for the choices that had led us to this moment. "The house is gone," Marcus said. "The bank foreclosed last week. I've been staying in a motel near the airport, but I can't even afford that much longer. I lost my contractor's license, so I can't work in construction anymore. And with the federal charges pending, no one will hire me for anything else." He looked up at me then, and I saw the child he'd once been, the boy who'd come running to me when he was hurt or scared or overwhelmed by the world's demands. But I also saw the man who'd been willing to steal my home, forge my signature, and warehouse me in a nursing home to solve his financial problems. "Mom, I know I messed up," he said, tears starting to flow down his cheeks. "I know what I did was wrong, and I know you have every right to hate me. But I'm begging you, please help me. I don't have anyone else." The irony wasn't lost on me. The son who'd tried to take everything I owned was now asking me to save him from the consequences of that theft. The man who'd attempted to have me, declared incompetent, was now admitting he couldn't manage his own life. The person who'd wanted to control my assets was now completely dependent on my mercy. "What kind of help are you asking for, Marcus?" "I don't know," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Money for a lawyer, maybe. A place to stay until I can figure out what comes next. A chance to make this right somehow." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the calculating manipulation that had characterized our recent interactions. But all I saw was genuine desperation and what appeared to be authentic remorse. The question was whether that remorse was for hurting me or simply for getting caught. "Marcus," I said carefully, "do you understand what you tried to do to me? Do you really comprehend what would have happened if your plan had worked?" He nodded miserably. "You would have lost your home, your independence, your freedom to make your own choices. You would have been trapped in that place while Jennifer and I stole everything you'd worked for your entire life. And why did you think that was acceptable?" "Because I was desperate," he said. "Because I was scared and drowning in debt, and I couldn't see any other way out. Because I convinced myself that you didn't really need all that money, that you'd be happier in a care facility where everything was taken care of for you." I leaned back in my chair, considering his words. There was honesty in them, but also the same fundamental selfishness that had driven his original plan. Even his apology was centered on his own needs, his own fears, his own justifications. "You didn't just try to steal my money, Marcus," I said. "You tried to steal my dignity, my autonomy, my right to live in my own home on my own terms. You were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent based on lies, to lock me away in an institution where I'd have no control over my own life, all so you could solve your financial problems." "I know," he whispered. "I know it was horrible. I know I'm a terrible person." "You're not a terrible person," I said, and meant it. "You're a desperate person who made terrible choices. But Marcus, the fact that you're here asking me to fix the consequences of trying to destroy my life tells me that you still don't really understand what you did wrong." He looked confused, like a student who'd failed a test without understanding the material. "You're asking me to save you from the results of your attempt to victimize me," I continued. "You want me to use the money you tried to steal to pay for lawyers to defend you against charges for trying to steal it. Do you see the problem with that?" Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, and I could almost see him working through the implications of what I'd said. Finally, he looked up with something that might have been understanding in his eyes. "You can't help me," he said slowly. "Not because you don't have the resources, but because helping me would be rewarding me for trying to hurt you." "That's part of it," I agreed. "But there's more to it than that. Marcus, I spent 43 years building a life, a career, a reputation based on integrity and hard work. I earned every dollar I have through honest labor and smart investments. You wanted to take all of that away from me based on lies and forged documents. How can I use the fruits of my honest work to help someone who tried to steal them through? Dishonest means? He nodded, fresh tears flowing. I destroyed everything, didn't I? My marriage, my business, my relationship with you, my children's respect. All for money that was never mine to take. Yes, I said simply. You did? We sat together in the gathering dusk, mother and son, separated by an unbridgeable chasm of betrayal and broken trust. Outside, Mrs. Peterson was walking her dog, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. Normal life continuing while our family fell apart. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now you face the consequences of your choices, I said. You take responsibility for what you've done. You serve whatever sentence the court gives you, and maybe if you're very lucky and work very hard at becoming the man I raised you to be, someday you might earn the chance to rebuild some small part of what you've destroyed. Marcus stood up slowly, like an old man carrying the weight of the world. Will you ever be able to forgive me? I looked at this man who'd once been my pride and joy, who'd graduated college with honors and started his own business and given me grandchildren I adored. I thought about the years of love and sacrifice I'd invested in raising him, and the casual cruelty with which he'd been willing to discard me when I became inconvenient. I don't know, I said honestly. But Marcus, forgiveness isn't something you can ask for. It's something you have to earn. And right now, you haven't even begun to do the work that earning would require. After he left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of our shattered family. Tomorrow, I would continue with my life, my independence intact, my dignity preserved, my resources protected. But tonight, I mourned for the son I'd lost, and for the grandmother his children would never know because of the choices he'd made. The battle was over. I had won. But victory, I was learning, could taste surprisingly bitter when it came at the cost of everything you'd once hoped to protect. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Hennepin County Courthouse watching Marcus shuffle past in orange jumpsuit and shackles, flanked by federal marshals. The judge had sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison after he pleaded guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges. 12 years for trying to steal his mother's life savings and home. 12 years for forging documents and lying to banks, and attempting to have me declared incompetent so he could control my assets. I didn't speak to him as they led him away. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the victim impact statement I'd submitted to the court. In that letter, I'd written about the betrayal, about the sleepless nights, about the way his actions had forced me to view every family interaction through the lens of potential manipulation. But I'd also written about accountability, about the importance of consequences, and about the hope that prison might give him the time and motivation to become the man I'd once believed him to be. Jennifer had moved back to Arizona permanently, taking Tyler and Emma with her. She'd found work as a real estate agent in Phoenix, using skills she'd learned during our brief periods of normal family life when she'd shown genuine interest in my career. The divorce had been finalized quickly once it became clear that there were no assets to fight over. Marcus had lost everything, and Jennifer had moved on to build a new life without the burden of his poor choices. The children wrote to me occasionally, short letters that their mother probably supervised, telling me about school and friends and their new life in the desert. I sent them birthday cards and Christmas presents, careful not to mention their father or the circumstances that had separated our family. They were innocent victims of their parents' greed, and I wouldn't poison their childhood with adult betrayals they were too young to understand. My house felt different now, though physically. Nothing had changed. The same furniture occupied the same rooms, the same photos sat on the same shelves, the same morning light filtered through the same windows. But the sense of security I'd taken for granted for decades had been permanently altered. I'd had locks changed, security cameras installed, and legal documents updated to prevent any future attempts at manipulation or coercion. More importantly, I'd restructured my entire estate to ensure that what happened with Marcus could never happen again. Everything I owned was now held in an irrevocable trust managed by professional trustees who had no emotional attachment to potential beneficiaries. My will specified that any heir who challenged the trust or attempted to have me declared incompetent would be automatically disinherited, their portion redistributed to charity. The charities I'd chosen were carefully selected for their missions and their integrity. The Minneapolis Women's Shelter, which provided safe housing for women escaping domestic violence. The Elder Justice Coalition, which fought against financial abuse of seniors. The Hennepin County Legal Aid Society, which provided free legal services to elderly residents facing exploitation. My money would go to organizations that protected people like me from people like Marcus. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Marcus's first attempt to pressure me into signing guardianship papers, I drove to Northwood Care Center. Not as a potential resident this time, but as a donor making a substantial contribution to their scholarship fund for residents who couldn't afford their full monthly fees. The same admissions coordinator, Lisa, greeted me in the lobby with obvious confusion. She remembered my previous visit, remembered that I'd been considering residency, and couldn't quite reconcile that with my current status as a major benefactor. "Mrs. De Vera," she said, shaking my hand with considerably more respect than she'd shown during my earlier tour. "Thank you so much for your generosity. This contribution will make a real difference for families who are struggling to afford quality care for their loved ones." I smiled, thinking about the irony of the situation. The facility where my son had planned to warehouse me against my will was now benefiting from my voluntary donation. The money he'd tried to steal was being used to help other families navigate the genuine challenges of aging and care, rather than the manufactured crisis he'd created to justify his theft. "I'm glad to help," I told Lisa. "I believe everyone deserves to age with dignity and respect, on their own terms, whenever possible." After the ceremony, I drove through the Minneapolis neighborhoods where I'd spent my career, past office buildings I'd developed and shopping centers I'd financed. The city had changed dramatically since I'd started in real estate, but the fundamentals remained the same. Location mattered, timing mattered, and trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. I thought about Marcus often, though I tried not to. According to his public defender, he was adjusting well to prison life, working in the library and taking classes toward a college degree he'd never finished. He'd written to me twice, letters full of apologies and promises to make amends when he was released. I'd read them but hadn't responded. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it wouldn't be rushed or forced or earned through prison letters that cost him nothing to write. The grandchildren would be adults by the time he was released. Tyler would be 25, Emma 23. They'd have grown up without him, built their own lives, formed their own opinions about the choices that had torn their family apart. Whether they'd want a relationship with their father after his release would be their decision to make, not mine to influence. My own life had found a new rhythm, quieter but more intentional than before. I'd joined the board of 3 nonprofit organizations, using my business experience to help them operate more efficiently and raise funds more effectively. I volunteered at the library's financial literacy program, teaching seniors how to protect themselves from the kinds of scams and family manipulation I'd experienced firsthand. I'd also started mentoring young women in commercial real estate, sharing the lessons I'd learned over 4 decades of building and negotiating and surviving in a male-dominated industry. These sessions took place in my home office, surrounded by the awards and photos that documented my career, proof that success was possible for women who were willing to work hard and think strategically. One of my mentees, a brilliant young woman named Sarah Chen, had recently closed her first major commercial deal. She'd called me afterward, excited and grateful, and eager to share her success with someone who understood its significance. During That conversation, she'd asked me about family support, about how to balance career ambitions with relationships and personal obligations. I'd told her the truth, that family should be your greatest source of strength and support, but that sometimes the people closest to you could become your greatest threat. I'd explained that trust was a precious commodity that should be given carefully and withdrawn immediately when it was violated. I'd advised her to build her own financial security, to maintain her own legal independence, and to never let anyone convince her that age or kindness or family obligation required her to surrender control over her own life. Most importantly, I'd told her that being underestimated could be a powerful advantage, that people's assumptions about women, about age, about perceived vulnerability could be turned into strategic weapons when necessary. The world was full of people like Marcus and Jennifer, people who saw others as opportunities to exploit, rather than relationships to cherish. The key to survival was recognizing them early and preparing accordingly. On Christmas Eve, I sat in my living room watching snow fall outside the windows Harold had installed 30 years earlier. The house was quiet, decorated with lights and a small tree that I'd bought and trimmed myself. There were presents underneath for neighbors and friends, for the women I mentored and the organizations I supported, for people who'd earned their place in my life through kindness and integrity rather than accident of birth. I thought about Christmases past, when Marcus was young and the future seemed full of possibilities. I remembered his excitement over presents, his laughter echoing through these same rooms, his small hand in mine as we walked through snowy neighborhoods looking at holiday decorations. Those memories weren't erased by his later betrayals, but they were changed, tinged with the sadness of knowing how the story would end. The phone rang just as I was preparing for bed. It was Angela Rodriguez, calling to wish me happy holidays and to update me on Marcus's situation. He'd been transferred to a minimum security facility, a reward for good behavior and his participation in educational programs. He'd also requested permission to write to me again, a request that would require my consent under the terms of the restraining order we'd obtained during the criminal proceedings. "It's your choice, Cassie," Angela said. "You don't owe him anything. Not even acknowledgement. But if you think communication might be beneficial for your own healing process, we can arrange supervised correspondence." I considered her offer while I finished my evening routine, brushing my teeth and checking the locks and setting the security system I'd never needed, before Marcus taught me that family could be dangerous. Did I want to hear from him? Did I want to know about his progress, his remorse, his plans for the future? Or was my peace better preserved by maintaining the silence that had protected me since his sentencing? "I'll think about it," I told Angela. "But not tonight. Tonight I want to focus on the life I've built, not the one he tried to destroy." After I hung up, I walked through my house one more time, turning off lights and checking windows in the ritual that had become second nature. My home was secure, my future was protected, and my independence was intact. I'd fought for all of it and won, but the victory had cost me the family I'd thought I had, and the naive trust I'd once taken for granted. Standing in my bedroom doorway, I looked at the bed where Harold and I had dreamed together, planned together, built a life together. He'd been gone for 15 years now, but I still felt his presence in this house, still heard his voice in the wind through the trees he'd planted, still drew strength from the love we'd shared when love came without conditions or calculations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to help others and protect myself and live according to the values that had guided me through 7 decades of joys and sorrows. I'd learned that family wasn't just about blood, that security wasn't just about money, and that strength wasn't just about winning battles, but about surviving them with your integrity intact. Marcus had tried to steal my future, but he'd only managed to steal his own. I was still here, still standing, still choosing how to spend my days and my resources and my remaining years. That was the real victory, not the legal judgment or the prison sentence or the public vindication, but the simple fact that I remained the author of my own story. The battle was over, the war was won, and Cassie De Vera was still home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.